Tonight on LTC News, UML students talk back to school.
A majority of the information that I've received has been over email, but what's stunning to me is I feel like a lot of the times I actually find out about this stuff on Facebook. Like, someone that I know who goes to UMass Lowell posted an article, and it's from the Lowell Sun or wherever, and it says UMass Lowell rolls back, in on-campus classes, or they change whatever. And I find out about it there before I get an email.
The Lowell Grotto is rebuilt.
About 1908 it started, and it's been there for over 100 years. And of course, over that period of time, a lot of wear and tear, and it really fell into the grotto itself, the cave and the hill there, where the cross is, fell into really bad disrepair.
And behavioral health during lockdown.
You can't just have people coming in, for therapy appointments, and things like that. It was just, too risky.
All this and much more on this edition of LTC News. Welcome to LTC News. I'm your host, Sabrina Peterson. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought many new stressors into our daily lives, one of the most intrusive being social isolation. In our first segment, we'll hear from Duncan Spiel from the Lowell Community Health Center about the effects of social isolation and the pandemic at large on the public.
For the health center and behavioral health services, we needed to get things up and moving quickly because obviously with the pandemic, you can't just have people coming in, for therapy appointments, and things like that. It was just, too risky. So we immediately had to rush and begin optimizing our electronic health record platform to be able to conduct, telehealth visits.
So it sounds like the transition to online hasn't been that big of a hurdle, because I would imagine that the in-person factor for something as intimate as these services is probably a big thing.
It is a very big thing, and that was the concern, I think, from the beginning. I mean, how do you assess affect? With somebody who's over the phone? How do you know if they're not doing well? How do you know what their presentation is? How do you know if they're running the influence? I mean, how do you know all these other different kinds of things? And so a lot of question marks. But we knew that we needed to trudge forward because it was patients, that needed this service. And obviously it wasn't optimal.
What are some of the stories that you've been hearing? Has there been like an uptick in service? Is it by and large been the same?
At least in the beginning, it was more of, supportive therapy, just meeting, patients where they're at. I mean, this was a crisis. And I think now it's moved on to, let's get into some other deeper issues within, therapy over the, over the phone or phone video. We've discovered that in certain instances, there is the opportunity to create a good therapeutic alliance between the patient and the clinician. And we've had quite a few instances where patients have almost divulged information that probably wouldn't have been easy to divulge had it been in person. So, I mean, if there's any type of a silver lining throughout all this, that would be one aspect of it. We've got certain patients that, are so afraid of getting the virus, they can't leave their house, or it creates anxiety for them if they're in an aisle shopping at Home Depot and someone, takes off their mask or something, and then they get into a scuffle with them, or, those kinds of things. Or, you have people that just don't care. So I think when you have the people that just don't care, and then the people that are very concerned about the virus, those two things, there's conflict there. Now more than ever, patients need these services. And so I just think it's absolutely critical. I mean, even people without substance use or mental health issues are now experiencing these issues as a result of the pandemic. So I think moving forward, it's going to be critical that all mental health clinics and behavioral health clinics, jump on board with telehealth.
On August 19th, the United Teachers of Lowell MA, a local teachers union, staged a large protest in front of City Hall over school reopening plans. In this next segment, we'll hear from several members of the union about their concerns about working conditions in the schools during the pandemic.
We want to have testing done by someone that we and administration from the school department or the city agree to. So it would be a fair testing process to make sure the environment within the building doesn't represent a hazard to either our students or our teachers or paraprofessionals, custodians, or anyone else that works in the buildings.
Buildings are not safe, and the people you see here are the people who live in the building. They're the teachers, they're the custodians, they're the cafeteria workers. They're in the buildings 6 to 8 hours every single day, and they've been doing that for years.
And we're insisting on that because we know the history, the chronic failure of our school system, of our infrastructure, and the lack of investment and maintenance that's caused us so much discomfort over the years. What has been uncomfortable in the past is critical now.
I mean, remote learning was definitely challenging for the teachers as well as the students, and we want to be back in school. Personally, my classroom has no windows, there's no ventilation, so what we want is a third-party assessment of ventilation.
When the teachers and these people tell you that the buildings are safe because the windows don't open, because there's no circulation, no ventilation, they're telling you the truth. The teachers and all these people want to be in the buildings. We want to be with the children. There's no question about that. But what we want it to be safe, not only for the teachers and the staff, but more importantly for the students, because they deserve the very, very best.
But we can't do it. And to just sort of pretend the pandemic isn't a factor doesn't make any sense. The first time, if it ends up the school committee continues to support this, then the hazards faced by students and by our members are going to be at their hands, or on their hands and their responsibility. We're trying to avoid that.
When you hire someone who may have some business with the city prior to this or has some connection or knows somebody, I don't know if that's the case, but there was a whole list of people or organizations that could have been selected and none of them were, and now we have a company. The union was never notified, it was never asked, it was never in any kind of collaboration with the decision of who they chose. That sends a red flag to us.
Why not prove to the parents and to the teachers and the staff that are going in that the buildings are safe? The only conclusion I have is they're reluctant to do it because they don't believe that the results are going to be what they're claiming them to be. So prove it to us. And most are not. 91% of our members supported our position in our survey. Over 80% say they're afraid to go into the buildings with face-to-face education for students because of the environmental hazards they've become so well acquainted with, unfortunately, over the years.
Honestly, I have made the decision to keep all 3 of my children home this school year. First and foremost, for their safety, so I know that they're safe. I figure a year is not a long time, and to know that my children and my babies are going to be home and not hospitalized and not in a coffin somewhere, that's what I know, and that's what I'll do for them as a parent. First and foremost is safety.
The University of Massachusetts Lowell announced that it is scaling back plans to open the campus to students for the fall semester. But how do the students feel about it? LTC spoke to 2 undergraduates to find out what it's been like dealing with the changes to campus life and about what they'd prefer for their classes this fall.
They sent out an email about midsummer talking about how they had plans to, move back on campus. And then as, you saw a rise in cases, they released another email. All of my classes are online, unfortunately. I have confidence that given that they've had, a lot of time, that it'll be a little bit better. But I haven't really received any super specific stuff on a class-to-class basis.
A majority of the information that I've received has been over email, but what's stunning to me is I feel like a lot of the times I actually find out about this stuff on Facebook. Like, someone that I know who goes to UMass Lowell posted an article, and it's from the Lowell Sun or wherever, and it says UMass Lowell rolls back, in on-campus classes, or they change whatever. And I find out about it there before I get an email.
Obviously, everything on campus, you got to wear a mask covering, social distance. All the labs they've cut down the class sizes and, spread them out. It's probably going to be a lot more isolated than I think a lot of us are used to. Of course, it's what we have to do. There isn't really an option at this point.
As far as I know, it sounds kind of like if you don't live on campus, you can't use things like the rec center or the library, which is definitely having a negative impact, not only on myself, but on other people I know who are saying, oh, well, I don't have the money for a gym membership, so I use the campus rec centers where I work out, and now they can't do that. If you're in class, like in person, you have to wear a mask, which I think is great and makes total sense. But what's problematic is the university isn't giving out masks.
They're going to be doing testing weekly, and they're breaking up people, one person per dorm. The dining halls are going to be open, albeit with changes. They're going to have takeout food and outdoor classes and such. But just there will be more people on campus, and just a net influx of people. You will probably see a rise in transmission in cases.
Based off of what I've been seeing other universities doing, I actually think our university has done a pretty decent job of putting student safety above all else. Should they have lowered tuition and had the higher ups take a pay cut? Absolutely. Should they probably have figured out this decision earlier? Yes. But, for example, my sister goes to school in Elon, which is in South Carolina. They're having in-person classes.
I do feel safe on campus. Mandatory covering, face coverings, and social distancing, bringing down class sizes. They're taking all the steps that are necessary, in my opinion.
We need to be, as a university that has money, doing more to help the people who make our city great. We have so much property that we've been buying up. Open one of the centers on campus that's closed to students anyways, and say, if you live within, this area of Lowell, free testing. If we can open the ICZ to people who are literally COVID positive, why not take a wing of that building for the people who are being forced to live in tents on the side of the river?
The Grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes, behind the former Franco-American school in Lowell, is a beloved landmark for people who grew up in the city. Although the school is closed and the property was sold to a developer, the Grotto remains and underwent a major renovation after a fundraising campaign. Stephen Panagiotakis, a member of the Lowell Grotto fundraising committee, explains their vision of the future for the monument.
The grotto sits on the banks of the Pawtucket Falls, which were the ancient and sacred fishing grounds of the Native Americans in this area. There, who was a very wealthy patent medicine and industrialist investor, and also a philanthropist, built this beautiful mansion and had all the grounds over there, right on the falls. He left sometime in the 90s and basically left it vacant for many years until about 1908. And the oblate priests of St. Jean the Baptist Church over on Merrimack Street purchased it with the hopes of putting an orphanage in there under the care of the Sisters of Charity of Quebec. And they wanted to bring something there that would, from a religious standpoint, that would last and be inspiring to their community. And they built the grotto, and they also built the Statuary of the Cross. About 1908 it started, and it's been there for over 100 years. And of course, over that period of time, a lot of wear and tear, and it really fell into the grotto itself, the cave and the hill there, where the cross is, fell into really bad disrepair. And when the building got sold, one of the promises and covenants was that he was going to allow the Franco-American School, the nonprofit, to continue to use the grotto, keep it open to the public 24 hours. I mean, really, it's an oasis of prayer, contemplation, meditation. People go there from all walks of life, at all times of day. Many just seeking out some type of solace. And we wanted to keep that going because it's really preserving our past for the future. It's a part of our history here in Lowell, both from a community standpoint, but also from a faith standpoint. We've tried to keep as much as the old as we can with regards to the structure and the stations themselves, but we also updated it, for the 21st century. It's really a community effort. CBA was huge in getting a grant for us to get this started. And then the Franco-American School, some of the proceeds from the sale, they gave a significant amount of money to keep us going. And now we're in the individual and community fundraising portion of it. We've spent about $750,000 so far in renovating and getting it ready, and designing and landscaping and electricity and plumbing and everything else that goes along with it. And we still need about another $200,000 to finish it. And so that's our effort right now. I really like seeing that cross up there. It kind of dominates that sky view when you're coming over from Pawtuckaville to the acre, and it always has. And to see that still standing, and then when you get up close, now you can look to the left and you see all the stations there. And at nighttime, with the new lighting we have there, it really is a beautiful, peaceful looking place, and we want to keep it that way.
In this week's Sunspot, Lowell Sun Enterprise editor Chris Scott sits down with Lowell City Councilor John Drinkwater.
Thank you for tuning in to this latest edition of the Zoom Sunspot. I'm Chris Scott, the enterprise editor at The Sun, and I want to welcome our latest guest, City Councilor John Drinkwater. John, thanks for coming in today.
Thanks, Chris, for having me.
I think we were talking off air a little bit about the whole issue of racism in the city of Lowell, and how the City Council narrowly voted 5-4 against proclaiming racism a public health threat. And then about 2 weeks later, the school committee narrowly votes, I think it was 4-3, to make that declaration that racism is a public health threat in Lowell. I know that when it was before the council, you had an active role. You wanted to see that happen. Tell us where you were coming from on that, and then share with us your reaction to the school committee then voting for it. Man, there's a disconnect if I ever saw one.
I think over the last couple months, and particularly in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in the protests as a result, there's really been a lot of activism in the community, and people really want to see their elected officials taking action. And I think you've seen a real movement throughout society and among elected officials, and the willingness to acknowledge racism in our society, including systemic racism. You've seen a huge movement just in the willingness to say a phrase like Black Lives Matter, which a couple of years ago even sounded somewhat controversial, and now you hear it coming from major corporations, from nearly all elected officials. And I think there was a reaction in the community to say, that's great. That we are moving in that direction, but we also need to see more movement as well. And I think the movement to declare racism as a public health crisis was a next step in that direction, really to say it's great that people are condemning explicit bigotry and explicit discrimination as clearly wrong. But there's also other systemic problems that exist and that have existed over centuries and that have actually caused disparate health outcomes among people of different races. And you can actually see these things in the fact that the average Black American has a life expectancy that's 4 years shorter than the average white American. And there are many reasons for that, and there are things we need to start addressing.
What specifically is happening in Lowell that in your view, racism is a public health threat?
Everyone in Lowell is really attuned to neighborhood boundaries and what different neighborhoods represent. And if you look at life expectancy just between neighborhoods in Lowell, it's very interesting, because if you look at Belvedere, the average life expectancy is 81 years old. Mm-hmm. But if you go over to Lower Belvedere, which have two neighborhoods that actually touch, the life expectancy is only 74 years old. Mm-hmm. Likewise, in the Upper Highlands, the average life expectancy is 80. In the Lower Highlands, it's 75. In Pawtuckaville, 79. Across the river in the Acre, it's 76. And certainly if you know these neighborhoods at all, you'll know that the racial and ethnic makeup is different between those, and you know that the neighborhoods with the higher density of people of color are the ones experiencing lower life expectancy. So I really thought that just looking at that data could really put it in very local terms to say, hey, this just isn't normal. There's no biological, there's no geographic reason why people living in neighborhoods that actually abut one another should be experiencing such big differences in life expectancy. And there's a lot of reasons that contribute to those differences, but I believe they all tie back to systemic inequities related to race, related to economic inequality, and the things that we really need to just start working hard to address.
So there are, as you said, many reasons for those sharp contracts in life expectancy in Belvedere, Lower Belvedere, the Highlands, Lower Highlands. But how does that constitute racism?
You could look at these neighborhoods and say, well, perhaps these differences in health outcomes are explained by economic inequality and not race inequality. And I would actually say that that's true, but it's impossible to separate out economic inequality and racial inequality, because they've both been tied together really through our society for centuries. And if you just look at economic outcomes among white Americans and Black Americans, the average household income for Black Americans is $40,000. For white Americans, it's $68,000. Now, there are reasons for that, and there are many of them, but you could look to one thing, and that's housing. When many families were building wealth that's accumulated over generations, is because they were able to purchase homes, oftentimes with federally backed mortgages in the 1950s, in the wake of the Second World War. And we know that those federally backed mortgages, some mortgages backed by the GI Bill, there was systemic discrimination against people of color from obtaining those mortgages and being able to purchase homes. That wealth has accumulated over generations. It's meant that many people of color have had to rent over generations and not accumulate wealth. So there's one way that racial discrimination is tied to economic inequality, which leads to different health outcomes. So I know that the term racism, can cause people to kind of get their back up and get defensive. We're not talking, necessarily about—
Several of your colleagues did.
Yes, and I get it. I get it. It's a very, very polarizing term, but the thing we're talking about is that, the from housing discrimination in the 50s to economic inequality now and health outcomes, we're not talking all about explicit bigotry. We're talking about systems that have led to this, and that, our communities of color are asking us to just learn about a little bit and acknowledge, so that we can create the policy solutions to improve.
What was your reaction to the school committee vote? And then what do you think's next?
Well, yeah, I was glad to see it pass on the school committee. And, I look at it and say, certainly because the council narrowly voted the declaration down and the school committee narrowly approved it, doesn't mean that, there's a health crisis in the schools, but not in the city generally. It meant that in one body, it had a little bit more support than another. But I think, it was important for the school committee to do, because I think making the declaration was really about acknowledging to communities of color that are really asking for action, that we understand the problem and we're committed to moving forward. And I still believe there's a big commitment on the council to move forward and make change. One thing I really point to is that on the same night where the discussion on the public health threat happened, it got a little bit less attention, but we also voted to create a task force.
Yes.
Made up by members of the community who would actually come together and make recommendations to the council on policy changes that we can make to start to address these things and work towards more equality in the city. And I think that's incredibly important. All the answers aren't necessarily going to come from the city council or come from the school committee. They should really come up from the ground up, members of the community who have been engaged in this work and who can bring ideas forward and recommendations forward to the city council. And I really hope that that task force will come together in short order and we can act on some of those recommendations.
The people who voted against it have been around for a long time, and it's not saying anything bad about them. Not at all. They've poured a lot of effort into the city and trying to make the city better. Do you think that this is, maybe new Lowell versus older Lowell? When you look at Samaras and you look at Rita and you look at Rodney, they've been around for a long time. Then you look at guys like yourself who are just kind of getting involved. And Sakari just getting involved. Just, he's serving in his first term too. Do you see it like that in those terms? You know, that this is maybe the new guard coming in as opposed to the older guard?
You know, I don't know that you can necessarily interpret it that way. I mean,
Yeah.
I think if you looked at the debate, I mean, everybody really spoke at length at their opinions on it. And I know everybody really, I believe, is committed to moving forward and making some positive changes. There were different approaches that were taken to that. But I think what it came down to really, it seemed that, you know, one interpretation of the motion was that it would paint the city in a negative light by somehow
Right.
labeling the city as racist. I disagree with that contention. In my opinion, I think it would have sort of painted the city more in a positive light when it came to working towards more racial equality. But, you know, I think ultimately when it came down to vote, there was some who thought there was a negative connotation or somehow, you know, paint the city in that light, and others who felt that it would put us more in a positive light. And for whatever reason, that difference just couldn't seem to be reconciled. But I certainly maintain that this was always meant to show that we're moving forward. We're certainly no different than anywhere else in the country. We just have the same issues as everybody else.
And that does it for this edition of LTC News. You can find us on LTC channels 8, 95, and 99, online at ltc.org, on Roku in the LTC News playlist, on Facebook at LTC Lowell, or on our YouTube page. We leave you now with more scenes from the Lowell Grotto. I'm your host, Sabrina Peterson. Thanks for joining us.